My name is Walter. I'm 64 years old, and I spent 31 years as a structural engineer. I built bridges. Real ones. The kind that hold 18-wheelers crossing frozen rivers in Minnesota winters. I understood load-bearing capacity, stress fractures, and the exact moment a structure would fail. I thought I understood people the same way. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about one person in particular, and that mistake almost killed me. I need to tell you what my son-in-law did to me last February, because I still wake up at 3 a.m. hearing the wind against those walls, and my therapist says talking about it helps. So does my daughter, my other daughter, Claire. She's the one who found me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually began, which is not in the mountains of northern Idaho. It started 22 years ago when my daughter Rebecca brought home a young man named Marcus at Thanksgiving. He was 26. She was 24, and he had the kind of smile that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. My wife, Diane, leaned over to me that night after dinner and whispered, "I don't trust him." I told her she was being protective. I told her every father feels that way about the first serious boyfriend. She said, "Walter, I'm not her father. I'm her mother. And something is off." Diane was right. She was almost always right. I wish she were here so I could tell her that. She passed away from ovarian cancer 6 years ago, 14 months from diagnosis to gone. I held her hand at the end and promised her I would be okay. I promised her I would look after the girls. Rebecca was 38 by then, already married to Marcus for 12 years, already the mother of my 2 grandchildren, Lily and James. Claire was 35, living in Portland, working as a nurse. Both of them stood on either side of me at the funeral and held my arms like they were the ones keeping me upright. They were. After Diane died, I did what men of my generation do. I kept busy. I took on consulting work. I joined a woodworking club at the community center in Boise. I drove up to see Rebecca and the grandkids every few weeks. Lily was 13 and James was 10, and spending time with them was the closest thing to joy I could find in those first 2 years of being alone. Marcus was always polite when I visited. He shook my hand. He poured me coffee. He called me Walter and asked about my consulting projects. But there was always something just underneath the surface, something I couldn't name. He'd make a comment about the housing market or my retirement portfolio, and then watch my face just a half-second too long, like he was measuring something. I noticed it, but I filed it away. I told myself I was paranoid. I told myself Diane's voice in my head was just grief, not intuition. 3 years after Diane passed, I sold our family home. We had lived there for 27 years, the house where the girls grew up, where we had Christmas every year, where Diane had planted a rose garden along the back fence that still bloomed every June. Selling it was the hardest thing I'd done since losing her. But it was too big for one person, and the upkeep was becoming a burden, and my financial advisor said it was the smart move. I bought a smaller place on the east side of Boise and put a significant amount of the sale into savings, not a fortune, but enough. Enough that Marcus noticed. I know he noticed because Rebecca mentioned it once. Casually, the way you mention something that has already been discussed at home. She said, "Dad, Marcus was saying you should really think about an annuity instead of just letting it sit in accounts." I said I had a financial advisor I trusted. She nodded and changed the subject. But that was the first time I heard him speaking through her, and I should have paid more attention. The call came on a Thursday in late January. Marcus. Not Rebecca, which I thought was slightly odd, but I didn't dwell on it. He said he had a buddy with a hunting cabin up near the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness area, 3 hours north of Boise. His buddy wasn't going to use it in February. He said, "Walter, you've been cooped up all winter. Let me take you up there for the weekend, just the 2 of us. Elk country. Fresh air." I feel like we've never really had the chance to just talk man to man. I want to be honest about something. Part of me was moved by it. I had always wanted a better relationship with Marcus. I had always hoped, for Rebecca's sake, that we might find some genuine common ground. I was 63 years old and lonely in ways I didn't fully admit to myself, And here was my son-in-law offering something that looked like connection, so I said yes. I told Claire about it when she called that weekend. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's kind of out of nowhere, isn't it? Marcus has never taken you anywhere before." I said maybe he was making an effort. She said, "Okay, just text me when you get there." I said I would. We left on a Friday morning in Marcus's truck. He was talkative for the first hour, asking about my engineering projects, asking about Lily and James like I was the one who needed updating on his own children. Then he got quieter. I watched the landscape change from high desert to pine forest to the kind of deep wilderness that swallows roads. We turned onto a Forest Service road around noon and drove another 40 minutes into the trees. The snow was heavy on both sides. The sky was the flat white of a system coming in. The cabin was small, one main room with a wood stove, a narrow kitchen area, a cot, and a bathroom with a toilet and a sink. A covered woodpile sat outside next to a small generator shed. Marcus carried in a cooler with 2 days of food and made a point of showing me the stacked wood, the extra blankets, the emergency candles on the shelf. He was thorough. He was almost theatrical about it now that I think back. We had dinner that first night, canned chili he heated on the propane stove, and we talked longer than we ever had before. He asked about my career. He asked about how I met Diane. He asked about the early years of raising Rebecca and Claire, and he listened the way a person listens when they're gathering information rather than enjoying conversation. But I was grateful for the attention. I was a 63-year-old widower eating chili in a cabin in the Idaho wilderness with his son-in-law, and for a few hours I felt like things were going to be okay. I went to bed early. The cot was narrow and the wood stove had cooled by midnight, and I woke up around 6 to a sound I recognized immediately, the particular silence of heavy snowfall. I lay there for a moment listening to it, that muffled, pressurized quiet. And then I noticed something else. The cabin was too still. No sounds of another person breathing, shifting, moving. I said Marcus's name. Nothing. I got up and went to the main room. His sleeping bag was folded on the floor with a precision that told me he hadn't slept in it. His duffel bag was gone. His coat hooks by the door were empty. I went to the window and looked out, and the truck was gone. 2 shallow ruts in the fresh snow already filling in. The snow was coming down hard and sideways. The Forest Service road we had come in on was invisible. I tried the door. The handle turned, but the door didn't move. I put my shoulder into it. Nothing. I looked more carefully and saw the latch plate on the outside frame, a hasp and padlock I hadn't noticed on the way in because it had been open. He had locked the door from the outside. I want to tell you what that moment felt like, but I'm not sure I have the right words for it. It wasn't panic, not at first. It was something colder than panic, a kind of terrible clarity, like watching a bridge calculation resolve into a number that means structural failure. The math was suddenly simple and awful. I was alone, locked in a blizzard 3 hours from the nearest town, and the only person who knew I was here had just driven away. I checked my phone, no signal. I had known service would be limited out here. Marcus had mentioned it on the drive up, casually, as if it were just a minor inconvenience. I had thought nothing of it at the time. I tried the windows. There were 2, one on the north wall and one on the east. Both had been nailed shut, not the original hardware, but fresh nails driven at an angle through the frames into the sills, 8 or 10 of them each. Recent work. Sawdust was still caught in the corner of the east windowsill. He had done this before we arrived, or he had woken up hours before me to do it that morning. That's when I found the note. It was on the kitchen shelf, tucked under the box of emergency candles like he'd placed it as an afterthought. Or maybe so I'd find it only after I'd tried everything else. It was written on a piece of notebook paper in Marcus's handwriting, which I recognized from birthday cards and grocery lists Rebecca had texted me pictures of over the years. It said, "Walter, by the time you read this, the road will be gone. Nobody comes up here in February. The generator has no fuel. I drained it. The woodpile will last 2 days. Maybe 3 if you're careful. But the storm coming is 4 days minimum. I checked the forecast before we left. I want you to know this isn't personal. You've always been decent to me, but Rebecca's share of what you have is the difference between our family being okay and not okay. The policy is enough. It'll look like exposure. An old man who went out for wood and got disoriented. I'm sorry. I read it twice. Then I set it back down very carefully because some part of my engineer's brain understood that it was evidence and that evidence needed to be preserved. Then I sat down on the cot for about 2 minutes and allowed myself to feel what I was feeling, which was a grief so specific and strange that I can't fully explain it. Not fear of dying, not yet, but the grief of understanding that someone had sat across from me the night before, asking about my wife, asking about my daughter's childhoods, while already knowing what the morning would look like. The intimacy of that deception was its own particular cruelty. Then I stood up, because I am 63 years old, and I was a structural engineer for 31 years, and I have spent my career solving problems under pressure, and I was not going to sit on a cot and wait for a man like Marcus to be right about me. Here is what I did. And I want to be specific, because the people who've asked me about this deserve a real answer. The nails on the windows were his first mistake. He'd nailed them shut, yes, but he'd used common nails, not screws, and he'd driven them into pine framing. I found a claw hammer hanging on a nail by the wood stove, the cabin's own tool, which he'd apparently not thought to remove. It took me 25 minutes of careful work to back out the nails on the east window without breaking the glass, because broken glass in a blizzard creates its own problems. I got the window open about 8 inches before the frame swelled from the cold and stuck. 8 inches was enough. I reached through with the hammer handle and knocked loose the hasp on the padlock. Not the lock itself, but the screws holding the hasp plate to the door frame. 4 wood screws that had been there for years and were sitting in soft wood. I worked blind, by feel, for about 40 minutes. My arm went numb to the elbow, but the hasp came free and the door opened. Now I was out, but the storm was serious. Wind driving snow horizontally. Visibility maybe 30 feet. Temperature I later learned was 11 degrees Fahrenheit, with the wind chill well below 0. I was wearing my long underwear, wool socks, a heavy flannel shirt, and my Carhartt jacket. Not inadequate, but not enough for extended exposure. I didn't try to walk out. That would have been the decision that killed me. The Forest Service road was gone under 18 inches of snow, and I had no idea of the exact route. And in a whiteout, you can walk in circles until you fall down. I knew this. Instead, I did 3 things in order of priority. First, I got wood from the covered pile and got the wood stove running hot. Heat was survival. Everything else was secondary. Second, I found the generator shed and confirmed what Marcus had written. He had drained the fuel tank. But in the shed, behind a plastic shelving unit, I found a 2-gallon metal gas can, the kind people leave at cabins for exactly this situation. It was about a third full. Not enough to run the generator long, but enough for one purpose. Third, and this is the part that saved my life, the bathroom sink had running water. This is something several people have asked me about. And I want to be clear, I never had to melt snow for water. The cabin had a gravity-fed water line from a small holding tank on the roof, insulated, and it was still flowing. I had water. Marcus had either not known about this system or not thought about it, which told me something important. He had planned this with cruelty, but not with expertise. He knew enough to strand me. He didn't know enough to guarantee it. I rationed the wood carefully. I kept the stove at the minimum temperature to stay functional rather than comfortable. I slept in all my clothes with both blankets and my jacket. I ate what was in the cooler slowly. He had left 2 days of food, perhaps intentionally, perhaps because removing it entirely would have seemed suspicious if anyone looked before the snow covered his tracks. I ate 1 meal a day. On the second night, the wind began to shift, which told me the system was moving faster than Marcus's 4-day forecast. By the morning of the 3rd day, the snow had stopped, and the sky was the brutal clear blue of a past front. I used the remaining fuel in the gas can to run the generator for 40 minutes, which gave me enough power to charge my phone to 30%. At this elevation, in this clearing, With the storm gone, I had 2 bars of service. I called Claire first. I don't entirely know why. Maybe because she had been the one who told me to text when I arrived, and some part of me felt like I owed her the call I hadn't made. She answered on the second ring. I told her where I was in as few words as possible. I told her about the note. She didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "I'm calling 911 right now. Stay on with me." I said, "Okay." She said, "Dad, I told you." I said, "I know, sweetheart, I know." The Lemhi County Sheriff's Office reached me by snowmobile about 4 hours later. 2 deputies, both younger than my youngest pair of boots. They came through the trees, and I was standing on the cabin porch, and one of them looked at me and said, "Sir, are you Walter Marsh?" I said I was. He said, "Your daughter has been calling every 15 minutes for 4 hours." I said that sounded right. I handed them the note before they asked for it. I told them to be careful with it. One of them put it in an evidence bag, and the other one helped me onto the back of the snowmobile, and I held on and watched the cabin disappear behind the trees. And I thought about Diane. I thought about what she had said about Marcus 22 years ago. Standing in our kitchen, keeping her voice low so the girls wouldn't hear. Something is off. She was right. She was always right. Marcus was arrested at his and Rebecca's home in Boise 36 hours after the deputies found me. He had apparently spent the intervening time behaving normally, going to work, picking up Lily from volleyball practice, making dinner. The detective who interviewed me later said this was not unusual. People who do calculated things tend to be calm afterward. It's the ones who act on impulse who fall apart. Rebecca called me from her sister-in-law's house the night Marcus was arrested. She was not calm. She kept saying she didn't know, and I believed her. I believe her still. She is my daughter, and she is not her husband. And she had been living with a man she thought she understood, just as I had spent an evening talking to a man I thought I was beginning to understand. We were both wrong. The difference is that only one of us was the target. The legal process took 14 months. I will not walk through all of it because it is still difficult, and because some of it involves my grandchildren in ways I'm not going to discuss publicly. What I will tell you is that Marcus was charged with attempted murder and convicted on that charge after a 4-day trial in which his own note was entered into evidence and read aloud to the jury. His defense argued that the note was hypothetical, a dark-humored journal entry, something he hadn't actually intended. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They did not find this argument compelling. He is currently serving 18 years at a facility in southern Idaho and will be eligible for parole when he is 61 years old. My grandchildren will be adults by then. Rebecca and the kids moved into a rental near Claire in Portland. She is in therapy. The kids are in therapy. The kids are in therapy. I see them on alternating holidays and every summer for 2 weeks. And Lily, who is now 17 and wants to study environmental law, sometimes calls me on Sunday evenings just to talk. Those calls are among the best parts of my week. I sold my house in Boise and moved to a smaller town in eastern Oregon, where I don't know very many people yet, but the mountains are visible from my kitchen window, and the woodworking club meets on Tuesday nights, and the people there are exactly the kind of people who don't ask too many questions and don't need you to explain yourself. I have started sleeping through the night again, mostly. The 3 a.m. wakings come less often now. There are things I think about that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. I think about the moment Marcus poured me coffee in that cabin on Friday evening and looked at me across the table and asked how Diane and I had met. I told him about the summer of 1984, a party at a friend's house, her yellow dress, the way she laughed at something I said, and then looked surprised that she had laughed. He nodded like he was genuinely moved. And maybe some small piece of him was. I don't know. I'm not interested in understanding what was happening inside Marcus. I spent too many years trying to understand structures that weren't worth understanding. What I think about more is the hammer. The one hanging on the nail by the wood stove that he didn't take with him. I've thought about this many times. Was it an oversight? Was it some piece of him that couldn't quite complete what he had planned? Was it simply a mistake? The kind of mistake that people make when they're more confident than they should be? I am an engineer. I have spent my career accounting for things people forget. low tolerances, material fatigue. The way a bolt seated wrong will hold for years before it doesn't. Marcus thought he understood the structure. He thought he had accounted for every variable. He had not accounted for a claw hammer on a nail, or a gravity-fed water line, or a third full gas can behind a shelving unit, or the fact that 63-year-old men who have spent their lives solving problems tend to keep solving them even when they are cold and afraid and have just read something devastating. He had also not accounted for Claire. I want to say one more thing before I finish, because it is the thing that has taken me the longest to figure out how to say. When I came out of that cabin on the third morning after the storm with the sky that impossible blue, and I stood on the porch and looked at the trees and the snow and the absolute silence of that wilderness, I felt something I did not expect to feel. Not relief, not yet. Something quieter than that. A kind of gratitude so large it had no specific object, just the fact of being upright, being warm enough, being present in a world that was still making the sounds it always makes, the wind through the pines, the creak of a branch weighted with snow. I have been angry since then. I have been sad. I have had the 4 a.m. fear. I have had days where I thought about what my granddaughter would have been told. Grandpa went out for wood and got disoriented. And I have had to put that thought down carefully, the way I put down the note, because it is too heavy to hold for very long. But I have also had Tuesday nights at the woodworking club and Sunday phone calls with Lily in the kitchen window with the mountains in it. I have had the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of still being here. Marcus calculated my value in dollars and came up with a number he thought was worth what he was planning to do. He was wrong about the math. He was wrong about the structure. He was wrong about what I was built to withstand. My name is Walter. I am 64 years old. I build bridges, and I am still here. If this story reached you today, I'd ask you one question, and I'd genuinely like to know your answer in the comments. If someone you trusted completely showed you exactly who they were, not gradually, but all at once, in a single moment, do you think you could ever fully trust anyone again? I've been sitting with that question for 14 months. I think I'm getting somewhere close to an answer, but I'm not there yet. Thank you for listening.